Now me name is Jim the carter's lad, a happy cock am I allus am contented, be the weather wet or dry. I snap me fingers at the snow and whistle in the rain. I've braved the storm for many a year and will do so again. So snap, crack goes me whip, I whistle and I sing. I sit upon me wagon, I'm as happy as a king. Me horse is allus willin', for him I'm never sad. There's none that leads a life so gay as Jim the carter's lad. My grandfather, Freeman Stannard, was born in 1875 in Bedfield, and he died in 1955 in Wickham Market. And I grew up in Hatchiston with my father Derek, who was Freeman's son, and during my childhood and young life I spent a lot of time at Bedfield and Wickham Market listening to the stories my father and my grandfather had told. My grandfather was a rabbit catcher. You'd call, in these days you'd call him a professional, but he didn't think of himself as a professional. He was a rabbit catcher and a casual farm labourer, and all the boys grew up the same. They all had ferrets and they all shot and they all worked on the land. And as I grew up, I've had ferrets all my life, and I still keep them now. And grandfather used to make all his own nets and snare hubs, and he used to go have a donkey and cart to take all his tools and his ferrets and everything he needed for the day's work, and that was his only means of transport most of his life. He never did own a bike. In fact, when the donkey died, he'd been so used to having a cart. When the donkey died, instead of getting another donkey, one of his boys, George, his boy, made him a hand cart, and that was what he used as his mode of transport. Although he walked, that carried his ferrets and all his other bits and pieces. He used to sell rabbits door to door. I think that must have been, I don't know the exact price, but I know he used to sell them for 6 and 6pence a dozen. When they went to London, he sold them to a local firm who took them to London, and they were 6 and 6 a dozen, with 2 dozen in a crate. And for that he used to have to, they weren't skinned, they were gutted and hung back to back in a crate. And one farm he went to was Roger Clough's at Leatheringham, and he used to take the rabbits on the rack on the back of his car. They used to put the crates of rabbits on a rack on the back of Roger Clough's car, and he used to take them to Ash Station for me grandfather, and that's how the rabbits got to London. The firm, me dad tell me, was called, not that that's much relevance, but the firm he remember was called Campbell, Key and Longley, so that must have been a firm of butchers in London, I assume. My grandfather used to use a muzzle-loader shotgun, which I'm proud to say I've still got, although it look a bit sorry for itself now and I won't want to fire it. This is his actual muzzle-loader he used to use, and he used to take the donkey out of the shafts when he got to wherever he was going to be rabbit, and he used to take the donkey out of the shafts, and that used to go with him all day. He wouldn't leave the donkey with the cart. He used to leave the cart and take the donkey with him. And if he was bolting rabbits, which he used to do a lot of, bolting loose rabbits, he used to have the donkey with him, and he used to shoot across the donkey's back. I know that takes some believing, but that's the truth. He used to lay his gun across the donkey's back, and that give him a bit of extra cover. If a rabbit come out, all that'd see for a start is a donkey, and my grandfather's head might be over the top, but he'd got the upper hand, and obviously with the time that took to load a muzzle loader, he wouldn't have had time to whip another cartridge in, so he had to make the shots count. And that was his way of, as I say, having the upper hand. He was on his own a lot of the time, although sometimes he'd have a boy or 2 boys with him. The donkey lived round the back of their house. They had 2 houses, 24 and 26 Spring Lane, and half the family lived in one house and The boys used to have, there was 10 boys and 2 girls, and the boys used to go round to sleep in one house, and the rest of the family stayed in the other, in their pair of cottages. The donkey lived in a thatched stable out the back of the cottage, as I say, and had what they called wind bushes for sides, sets of rails round the sides of the stable with wind bushes in between the rails and just a thatched roof. And the boys, I say the boys, but my father is the youngest of 8, and he's over 80 now, but when he was a boy, the boys, as he said, used to give the donkey a lump of coal, because that amused them to see the donkey crunching a lump of coal, and that used to, I don't know where it went, but they reckon that used to get rid of it, some way or another. And I can remember when I was a boy, in the back of their old house, there was a hook in the ceiling. I always thought that was for, I suppose it was, all for hanging, like they'd hang a bird on this hook for plucking, and they'd have hung all sorts of other rabbits probably hung on there or whatever. But one thing my father told me more recently was his father, Freeman, made his own brass snares, and he used to use that hook in the ceiling to hang to put the brass wire over, and then he put a 4-pound weight on the bottom and spun the weight with his hands, and that's how he used to twist up his snares and put the eye in the end of the snare. And that was the sort of, I mean, I suppose that was the main reason, was that it was cheaper to buy the raw materials, and that was buy the ready-made snares. And the same with his hubs. He used to make the snare hubs and trap hubs, and he used to set what they call spring tap. My grandfather used to make all his own snare hubs, and a hub is what they called just a name for a stake, really. And he used to start with about a 10 or 11-inch long bit of ash pole, and split that out into squares, and then he'd mark it across the end here. These are some I've just been and got out of the shed. You can see they aren't very clean, and they look as if they've seen better days, but that was just a riven bit of ash with a notch cut in there with a saw, and then the rest of it was done with a draw knife, the point, and into the bit where the snare go on. And that was exactly the same thing for a trap hub. So he'd make these exactly the same for the hubs, for the snares, and for what he used to use, what they call light spring traps, which is like a gin trap, only instead of having a flat spring, the spring is made out of rod with a couple of turns, and then the spring go to where the jaws of the trap are. And he'd go and set 2 or 3 dozen of these light spring traps in the mouth of the rabbit holes in the evening, and then the next morning when he went rabbiting, the rabbits would either come out of the hole if they were in, and hopefully there'd be one in the trap, or the rabbits what went in there, they'd get caught on the way in. So right in the mouth of the hole where the loose soil was pulled out by the rabbits is where he used to set his, as I say, what they call light spring traps. And I'll just tell you a little story about. There was an old boy who he used to go to a farm at Pettistry, White House Farm at Pettistry, and he set these light spring traps, as I say, and when he went to look at them in the morning, a lot of them had the rabbits took out, and he could see they'd had something in them, and that had been took out. Someone had been pinching his rabbits, and he was getting an old man by then, but he was still wise enough. He found out he didn't need to go to the police. He found out who that was. He looked at the damp. He could see in the damp sand in the front of the hole where someone had put their knee to bend down and take the rabbit out of the trap, where they'd put their knee in. There was an imprint in the sand, and that showed a patch on the knee. He could see a patch on the knee of his trousers, and he worked out who that was. I can tell you who that was because he's dead now. That was an old man called Diddler Hums, and my grandfather worked out who that was, had been taking his rabbits, and he knocked on his door, and he said, "You can bring my rabbits back, put them in my shed, then I won't have to get the police." That was all he said, and sure enough the rabbits come back. So he was his own you could say he was a law hunter himself. He sorted that out without involving the local constabulary. Another thing my grandfather used to do was catch moles. He caught moles and rats. He used to catch mice in a sweet shop in Wickham Market in the mouth of Chapel Lane. There was a sweet shop run by two old ladies called Mrs. Easter and Mrs. Butcher, and he used to catch mice in the shop. But the mole skins is something I can remember as being nailed all round the wall of the outside privy was mole skins. That was where he tacked them to dry, and obviously they were sold as well. I can't tell you how much that was for, but he'd have sold the mole skins. He didn't put them up there for wallpaper. They were put up there to dry and sell. And another job he did was he had a night soil cart. People refer to it as the honey cart, but they called it the night soil cart. And he used to have a hand cart and go round the back of the rows of houses round the back side of the old privies, and not empty the pails, but empty what you'd call, I suppose you'd call it, we call it a septic tank, but that was just a square pit at the back of the privy about 6 foot deep, and he had to empty them out with a jet, which I still got as well. I'm a bit hang on to a lot of his old things. A long handled, like a hand cup on a long wooden handle, and he used to empty the privy tank or septic tank into the hand cart, and then he had to wheel it. They didn't take it far, they just wheel it across the field, and had his two boys, Reuben and Russell, with him, one to hold the candle so he could see what he was doing, because they had to be done at night, and they'd dig a hole and empty the cart into the hole in the ground. We think of that as being a funny thing nowadays, the honey cart or emptying that, but that must have been a dirty old job for him to have to do, and that's another job he did to make ends meet. And another job he did was mowing the churchyard. My grandfather used to go and mow the churchyard with a scythe, and that would have took him 2 or 3 days to do that. It's a big churchyard, and to mow all round the gravestones, and he got £1 to do that once a year. He got £1 a year. And my Uncle Reuben thought his father was getting a raw deal. As Reuben was one of the older boys, he thought his father was getting a raw deal. He said, "Father, you want to tell him us worth 30 bob? They aren't paying you enough to do all that for £1." So my grandfather went to the parish clerk and he said, "I don't think you're paying me enough for cutting that churchyard. I shall want 30 bob to cut that." And they always everyone knew him as Joe, although his real name was Freeman. He said, "Joe, I think I pay you well to do that job." And he said, "Well, if you think that, say you better cut that yourself next year." And he wouldn't do it anymore. He never done it no more. Reuben had advised him he weren't getting paid enough, and he sorted that out. Another job is what they all did. Well, my father being the youngest, he never did so much of it, but the older boys and my grandfather, they all used to go sugar beet hoeing together. And my grandfather had a good reputation for getting work, so he used to have 1 or 2 what you might call taggers on, and they'd string along with them because they knew he'd find good work. And my grandfather and my Uncle Reuben and my Uncle Russell were all sugar beet hoeing together, and they'd got this old boy, another old boy called Fred Smy. He tagged along with them and worked with them. They got on all right with him. We used to go sugar beet hoeing with him, and he always caged tobacco. I mean, he'd have some of his own, but he'd always run out and cage tobacco. My grandfather smoked a clay pipe, and Russell rolled his own cigarettes, and he always used to scrounge rolling tobacco off Russell. Well, Reuben never smoked himself, but he could see his brother was getting his tobacco caged off him, so he took it upon himself. He was the one who always sorted out the problems in the family, if there was any. He always had money. If anybody wanted any money, he'd always got money when nobody else had. He was a bit of a dealer. He took it upon himself to solve Russell's tobacco problem. So he said to Russell, "When your tobacco tin get nearly empty, boy, you give that to me. Just leave a little dust in the bottom." So Russell left a little dry tobacco in the bottom of his tin and gave it to Reuben, and Reuben got his father's powder, black powder, what he used to load his muzzle loader with, and black powder was really mucky old stuff what they had that was smoked before smokeless powder come out for making cartridges. They all used black powder and in early cartridges, and he got the black powder and put a little measure of black powder in this tobacco tin and mixed it in with some dry tobacco and said to Russell, keep that in your other waistcoat pocket so you make sure you don't use it. And sure enough, I knocked off Saturday dinner time to go and have a pint at Wickham Crown, which is no longer there. It's a dentist now. They went going to Wickham Crown for a pint, and sure enough, old Fred said, hey, you got any bacca, Russell? Russell said, no, I ain't got any left. I only got a little old drop of short. He said, that's all right, that'll do. So he got his pipe out and took Russell's bacca and rammed all of it in. He didn't leave any for Russell. He rammed all this old black powder and tobacco into his pipe, put it in his mouth, and when he lit it, that blew the bowl clean off the pipe and laid him on the fumes from the black powder, laid him out flat on his back. And my grandfather said, said to Reuben, he said, you killed him, boy. He said, I don't know if I killed him, but he'll want no more bacca of Russell, will he? And that was how he solved Russell's tobacco problem. Another time, when they were rabbiting, Reuben was right a good shot. He didn't miss a lot, so his father's favourite to take shooting, because he didn't waste the cartridges and he didn't let anything get away. He was using his father's gun, and they were right beside the A12 at the White House at Petterstry, and shooting Bolton rabbits, and his father was looking after the ferrets, and Reuben was shooting. And he, as I say, he didn't miss. I never seen him miss anything when I was a boy growing up. I thought he made that look so easy. But an RAC man pulled up with a motorbike and sidecar, and he said to my grandfather, as I say, they called him Joe. He said, "Can I have a shot, Joe?" He said, "Yes, you can have a shot. You wait till my boy miss one, then you can have a shot." And I reckon he stood there about 2 hours waiting and never got. Reuben didn't miss one, so he said, "Oh, I'll be going now then," and off he went. He never got his shot, and I suppose my grandfather knew he weren't going to get one. I say when my grandfather, his old donkey died, it had only been his only means of transport, and George, another one of my dad's brothers, his son, made him a handcart. George was the one who was of the family who was inventive and clever with his hands, and he worked on motorbikes and cars, and he'd rebuild wheels and all sorts of things. He made his father a handcart, and my grandfather took it to Clough's at Leatheringham, and he was rabbiting the other side of the hedge and left his handcart round on the road, and when he went out to get it, that had gone. So he was a poor old bugger, was an old man, and some young boys had come along, and for a prank they took it and pushed it all the way to Charsfield and left it in the middle of Charsfield. But well, one of the dad's brothers had to go and retrieve that for him and get that back. And my Uncle Reuben, who I mentioned a little while ago, he was one of the older boys. He was the one who always sorted out the problems in the family. He always had money in his pocket, and he always used to give his mother all his money. When he earned his money, he used to give it all to his mother. He didn't give it to her to keep. He used to give her his money to look after, and he used to ask her for a shilling every Monday morning, because his belief was if you took money on a Monday morning, you'd take money all the rest of the week. So that was his thing. He did always have money. I can always remember him having money. He never drove, but if anyone else in the family needed a car, he was the one who they'd go to. He'd sort them out, and I know you shouldn't have favourites, but I have to say he was my favourite uncle. He was a rum old boy. As I say, he was a good shot, and he never took any rubbish off anybody. He used to go up to. When I was a boy, I can remember him. He always used to be waiting on Wickham Hill on a Saturday night. He used to go to Ipswich every Saturday night on the bus for a pint at the Blue Coat Boy. And during the day when we were watching whatever we were doing, he had a small holding. He used to have a tractor and a few little implements. He always rented a bit of land. And 4 o'clock every Saturday, regardless of what he was doing, if he's halfway across a field harvesting taters, or if he was halfway across a field drilling, if he'd look at his pocket watch and that was 4 o'clock, he'd got to stop, walk up the lane. He always walked up to his house up Chapel Lane. That was about half a mile from where his land was. He'd have a sack of wood on his back for the fire, and he'd got to get home in time to watch the wrestling. That was his pleasure. Apart from going for a pint on a Saturday night, he always had to watch the wrestling. Although we always said that was fixed, that was Reuben's. That was his. He didn't watch a lot of telly, but that was his program. He always had to watch. And he always, amongst other things, apart from the fact, as I say, he was a good shot, and I ain't saying it just because he was my uncle, he was a good shot. He always had a good gun dog. And he'd have a dog that would do anything he told it to. He could tell his dog to lie down and leave it, and he could have gone to work all day and come back, and that'd still be in the same place. And he never went to the vet either. If a dog or anything had anything wrong with it, he'd know how to put it right. And he, as I say, he always had a good dog, and he trained his own gun dogs like people did. There weren't such things as a gun dog trainer for somebody else in them days. And there was an old boy called Johnny Spall. He crazed Reuben for his dog. He had a good gun dog, and he wanted a good gun dog. He'd pay the price, and Reuben said, "No, I aren't going to sell it." He wouldn't sell his gun dog. He couldn't put a price on a dog, or not his good gun dog. Anyway, a few days later, a bloke from called Donald Spear from Melton Hill come to him, and he said, "Reuben, I got an old black Labrador I want to get rid on. That bark, keep the neighbours awake. I can't." He said, "I can't have that like that." He said, "Can you do away with that for me?" Because that was another thing Reuben would have done. But instead of doing away with it, that looked enough like his, so he decided he could sell that. He sold that to Johnny Spall and told him that was his dog, and got the money. And of course, it weren't any good for a gun dog. All that could do was bark and keep people awake. So the bloke come after Reuben and wanted his money back, but he didn't get his money. I don't know what happened to the dog, but Reuben won't give him his money back. He was a horse breaker as well. He used to break horses. He always kept ponies himself. He rented a bit of land, a 3 or 4 acre meadow. I always knew when I was a boy as Billy Hall's meadow. And I didn't know Billy Hall. He died before I was born, but they always called it Billy Hall's meadow. And Reuben rented this meadow off Billy Hall, thinking that he always thought that belonged to him. And one day Reuben was out in the road cutting the hedge, the side of this bit of meadow, and a chap pulled up in a motor. A well-to-do looking man. He said, "You're cutting the hedge for Mr. Hall, young man." And he said, "No, I aren't, sir, I'm cutting that for myself." And he told him he rented it off Billy Hall. He said, "Well, he got no business renting that to you. That belonged to me, that meadow." So Reuben surprised him, I expect. He said, "Well, will you sell that to me?" He said, "Yes, young man, I'll sell it to you." So they done a deal there and then, and Reuben bought the meadow and never told anything to Billy Hall. A week or two later, Billy Hall went to Reuben to collect his rent, and Reuben said, "I can't rent that off you no more, that's mine now." And he'd bought it without even telling him. That was the sort of thing he would do. And Billy Hall he had a reputation for being he was an unofficial bookmaker amongst other things, but he was a very shrewd man and sharp. So to put one over on him was I think that was a feather in anybody's cap. But Reuben, he could do that. Half asleep, he could do that. And another time, but must have been before that, because I don't suppose Billy would have come after him no more. He said, Billy Hall said to Reuben, "I've got a pony, iron grey pony, Reuben. I can't do nothing with it. I can't catch it. Will you catch that and put it in a cart and drive it for me?" And Reuben said he would. And one Sunday morning, my father and Reuben and Russell and Jack and Dougie, another brother, they all went to see if they could catch this pony, because they could see that was going to be a rum thing to catch. And on this old meadow, which belonged to Billy Hall still at the time, there was 2 thorn bushes, about 3 or 4 yards apart, and Reuben decided he was going to snare this horse, so he got a wagon rope and put a snare up in between the 2 thorn bushes, and between them, the brothers, between them, they corralled the horse and made it go in between these. They runned it and made it go in between these 2 thorn bushes. They herded it through, and the rope went round the neck, and when it come to the end of the rope, that flung it on its back and winded it, poor old thing. And Jack, who was the warrior of the family, he was, I suppose he might have took after his father a bit. He was a bit more, he weren't as what you might call, he cared about animals for one thing, and he thought that was hurt. He said, "You killed that poor old horse, Reuben." He said, "I don't know if I killed it, I caught it." And he didn't care. He'd caught it, and he got it in a cart and driv it. That was Reuben. And on his bit of land, as I say, I mentioned at the beginning, Reuben was a poacher as well. He wouldn't have minded me saying that now. And he always put meat on the table. There was 10 of them, 10 children and mother and father, and Reuben was always the one. He'd always put meat on the table when his father was getting too old to do it himself. Reuben always put meat on the table, and he said to Reuben one day, my father tell me, he said to Reuben one day, "Where do you get all them pheasants from, boy?" He said, "I get them off my midder." He said, "Oh, well, you must have got some lot of pheasants on that little old midder." He didn't question him any further, but he knew he weren't getting them all off his own place. And Reuben was a dealer. He'd sell anything had got a price. And my father said he come home from the pub one night. He was only in Wickham, but he come home from the pub, walked across the fields home from the pub with just his socks on his feet, because someone had wanted to buy his boots and the price had been right, so he sold his boots and walked home in his socks across the fields. That was the sort of thing he'd do. And another brother, Russell, who was about the same age as Reuben, he was the one who I told you about earlier, had his tobacco caged. He was a shoemaker. He was a shoemaker by trade and a repairer, and he had his own hut stood in the yard of the Vine public house at Wickham, where he used to repair boots and shoes. And another thing he did, he was a blacksmith, which was a combination. He'd make shoes and shoe the donkey, father's donkey. And father told me a story about when they were boys. They used to get the donkey. The donkey weren't very good to shoe. It wouldn't stand still when they wanted to shoe it. So they used to get it on the ground on its back and hold it, and they used to shoe it with its feet up in the air. How true that is, I don't know, but I expect that is true. Russell used to make his own nets. As I say, my grandfather made all his own nets, and he passed that on to his boys, my father and my Uncle Russell. I can remember making them. And Jack, another uncle, he made his own nets, and Russell was the one who showed me. He taught me to play the accordion as well, the button accordion, and I've still got his accordion indoors, and he died 20 years ago, I expect, and I've still got fag ash all in the top of the folds of the bellows, and I've left it all squeezed in, and I left it just as it was. It's just as he last, although I do play it, that stay there, and it's just as he last played it. And I can remember that coming out from under his old armchair he used to keep it in the Dr. Martin's boot box. He'd get that out and play me a tune, and that was what inspired me to want to play one myself. And he taught me. He ain't got a lot of patience, and he'd swear at you if you made a mistake, but he did teach me. And the same with making rabbit nets. He taught me to do that. And yeah, this is my Uncle Russell's old accordion, which I'm pleased to say I still play. It's still in good playing order. And he taught me to play that, to start with, by getting out from under his chair and playing a tune for me. He probably knew I'd want to learn. he lived on his own in Mill Lane in Wickham Market, and I expect when I went over there to learn to make rabbit nets and things like that, that was probably, well, it would have been company for the poor old boy, but he was a good teacher, apart from the fact he'd swear at me if I made a mistake. He ain't got a lot of patience, but he was still a good teacher because he knew how to do it. And one of the first tunes he taught me to play on this whole thing was God Save the King, he called it. Well, they changed the words now, but the tune is still the same, so I'll just give you a quick burst of God Save the King in memory of Russell on his old box. As you can hear, it's a little bit raspy now, a little bit rattly. I expect that's got 1 or 2 spiders in it, but it's a good old thing. And even though I got 1 or 2 more that look a bit more smarter than this one, this is my favourite because that's the one I learnt to play. And I had a lot of pleasure out of playing them since then. His tunes, I can't remember him. My father said he used to play in Wickham Vine, but most of my life I can only ever remember him having this indoors and playing. And he always sat in the same old chair, had a little Rayburn fire where he sat beside, and he had a rum sense of humour. I know it sounds dangerous nowadays, you wouldn't do that with children, but he had some what you call rookies, which are bangers. And I remember sitting around there with him one night, must have been near bonfire night, and he got one of these rookies and held it in the fire and lit it and handed it to me. Well, I knew what it was, I didn't know what to do with it, so I said, what am I supposed to do with that? And he said, well, hull it out of the letterbox. And he lived on it wasn't a busy road, but there could have been someone walking past, and that was hissing, so I had to get rid of it. I poked it out of the letterbox just as that went off, and well, I don't know if there's anybody out there or not, but if there was, that would have scared them. But Russell didn't care. He was in the artillery during the war, and in his national service days, he didn't like being told what to do. He was, I suppose you'd say he was I don't know if he was the black sheep of the family, or he was slightly odd compared to the rest of the brothers, and he didn't like being told what to do. He never went to a wedding or he never went to a funeral. He never had his photograph took, so I can't show you a picture of Russell. He wouldn't have his picture took. He used to cut my hair when I was a little boy, I do remember that. Going to Russell's for a haircut, I never went to a hairdresser, I always went to Russell, and he used to cut my hair and then give me a bar of chocolate. So probably when I got older, I probably wondered why you had to pay when you had a haircut and didn't get no chocolate. But that's what Russell used to do. He'd got proper hair, but hand barbers, clippers and scissors, and he'd done a good job. He cut all the family's hair when he lived at home, so they all had a haircut, and as I say, he mended all their boots. And I've still got his old hut in my yard here as well, which I suppose I'm lucky having a yard I can keep it in, because that looked a bit rough, but I'm going to repair that. That's still got the board on the side which used to say RR Standard Boot and Shoe Repairs, modest good work and modest prices, that said on the side of his hut, and I hope to put that back to how that was. I've only just recently reacquired it. Now I know for a fact that was his hut, and then later that became my Uncle Reuben's, where before the days of steel gun cabinets to keep your gun in, Reuben used to lay his gun out on a couple of the rafters in the roof of this old hut. He never put any oil in it or never cleaned it properly. He used to poke, I can remember it to this day, his idea of cleaning a gun was to poke a dead nettle through in case there was a cobweb in it, and that was clean. But that didn't miss a lot. That didn't matter about that being rusty, and you could very near see through the barrels, but that didn't worry Reuben. That still killed a pheasant. That didn't matter. It could be getting away fairly, he'd still get them. Anyway, I digressed a little bit. I was talking about Russell. in his national service days, he spent nearly all his time in the glass house because he wouldn't be told what to do. He rebelled against any sort of being told what to do, and he spent most of his time in the glass house. But a little story my dad told me when he was a boy, somehow or other, Russell managed to acquire a greyhound. He was in, I think he was at Salisbury. He managed to acquire a greyhound, and he wrote home to his mother and said he told her about this dog, and he said, I'm sending it home on the train. Can you get it collected from the station? So my father and Reuben went with a pony and cart to Ash Station. They thought they weren't at all expecting there to be a dog, knowing Russell, but sure enough, the train come in at Campsie Ash Station, and there on the back wagon in a wooden crate was a greyhound, and that was Russell's. He'd sent this dog home, and they kept it for him, looked after it for him till he come home, and that was his dog. And although it wouldn't have been the same one, I remember him having greyhounds when I was a boy. He still had, he always kept greyhounds, and they were used in them days for coursing, which was they could do. And that was Russell. And his ferrets, he always kept ferrets as well. He always went ferreting on his own. I don't really remember him coming ferreting with us. He used to keep ferrets, and he used to go on his own. And one time I do remember me and my dad went ferreting with him. He wanted some help because he was going to ferret a big old pit, which would have been difficult on your own to loose ferret this pit. So me and my father went with him, and I can remember one of Russell's ferrets. He had little old ferrets, little old polecat ferrets with the stripy faces, which I've still got a pair of now in the yard, the same breed. And I can remember a big old buck rabbit bolting out of one side of the pit with a ferret on the back. That's as true as I sit here, and that went right across the other side of the pit and down another hole. And because you couldn't shoot the rabbit, the ferret was hanging onto the rabbit's back, and a big old buck rabbit that ran right across the pit and into another hole and disappeared down another hole with the ferret still on it. And that's the one and only time I ever seen that happen. I don't think that's very likely to happen anymore. But as I say, Russell taught me to play the accordion, and another thing he taught me to do was make nets. And that, to me, nowadays, to do that, I suppose people do still do it, but that was handed down to them, and they just took that for granted, making their own nets. They never bought nets. And the nets you buy nowadays are nylon, and they're horrible things to use. They hang up on everything. And these ones are made with old hemp string, proper net and twine. And this one here is made by my Uncle Jack, because he made them as well. And his peculiarity with Uncle Jack's was, he used to use an old pair of boots and cut a bit out of the top of the boots with two eyelets in, and that's how he used to put the rein in for his nets. He used to actually make the net onto a piece out of the top of a pair of boots with two eyelets in for the reins to go through. So obviously when the rabbit got in, that would draw up. And now is your rabbit caught. But the way I was taught to do it by Russell was to make them on a ring, like I've got here on the corner of this stove. He used to make them on a ring, and then just put the two reins, when you're finished making the string net, that's got a rein go around the outside to draw it up like a purse. And the two reins went through this ring, and this end would go on a hub, the same as these snare hubs here, what I showed you earlier. That would either go on a hub, or if you're setting a net, invariably wherever you go to lay a net down where there's a rabbit, you aren't far enough away from a little bit of stick. It's only just got to be hooked over something like that. That's enough to draw that up, and once that's drawn up, that don't matter if that come off the hub, the rabbit can't go anywhere. That would pug them up. A rabbit would get, when a rabbit is caught properly in a net, that won't look like a rabbit, that'll look just like a ball of fur, because that'll only be about that big, and that's caught, and that's a clean killed rabbit. And when we say a clean killed rabbit, it's been caught in a net, not had any shot near it. And when my grandfather had gutted a rabbit, you wouldn't know that had been gutted. He'd cut such a neat little slit with his knife, and he'd take the guts out of a rabbit through a slot you couldn't hardly get two fingers in, and that'd be as neat as you like. And now when you see them, you see people put rabbits in the market and they cut them from the rib cage right down the slit the whole belly open, and they look horrible compared to the way they should be done properly. Anyway, as I say, Russell taught me to make nets, and this is a full size. This is a new one actually that I've made. This is a full size netting needle made out of a bit of ash, and that's the right size for making a rabbit net. That's exactly the right size with the string on. That'll go through that slot, although it don't look like it from there. But the net needle I'm using at the minute is a one made for the size for rats, or this particular one was made for making billiard table nets, and that'll make the right size holes for a billiard table net. But I'm using that today for just to show you how my Uncle Russell taught me to do it. And I just put a half hitch around the end of that needle to stop the string coming off while I aren't doing it. And this is how the last row is finished. Put onto this what we call the board. This is the board, and that's how whenever you finish a net, that's the way to leave it really. So the board is hanging in the net, and that can't become separate from the net. Then to start the next row, which is 22 holes, there's 22 knots across that way, and this is about half a net, so there's about 11 knots on there. When that's 22 knots long that way and 22 across there, that'll be a finished purse net. And as I say, when you've done one row of knots like that, you just pull that off the board like that. And then you're starting on the other end where the string left off there, and you've got to allow enough room across that board to get all 22 on. So you've got to start right over this side with your thumb on top of the string and the knot there, and you go through the first hole of the net, up through the first hole from the bottom, and pull that tight against the board, and you always control that with your thumb on the top. Then the needle come up from the bottom over the first two. There's 3 strings there now, the 2 holes and the end of the last one. The needle come up through the first 2 like that, and as you pull that up, that form a loop here, and that go down through the loop, and then you form the first knot on top there with your thumb, and keep them, and then the next one you just carry on like that across the net, keeping that all straight. They're all got, if these are slanted across the board, the holes will all be different sizes. I can remember getting swore at a lot of times by Russell for not keeping it square. It's got to be just right. But when he'd told you something, you learn off somebody like that who swear at you when you make a mistake. You think twice before you make another one. Because I'd rather be told like that and learn how to do something properly. But you do take note. You do sit up and take notice when you get swore at properly. That teach you. So this back finger is keeping them square on the board, and as I say, you just go over under 2 bits of string down through that hole and pull the knot, and that's coming across there now, as you can see, the next row. And we'll go right the way across. I won't sit here and make a whole net because that's quite a time consuming job. I'm just going to give you a demonstration how to do it. And my dad's brother Russell, well, his father, my grandfather used to do it as well. They'd sit beside the fire and there'd be a hook on the mantelpiece, which I've still got indoors on mine, where I have a net hanging to make. And that'd be their winter time. They didn't do jigsaws or watch the telly or anything like that, or have a radio. Their entertainment, or they'd pass the evenings away doing this. And my Uncle Jack made 75-yard long nets and shorter ones for gate nets. And I can remember sitting watching them when I was a little old boy, and Thinking that'd be nice to be able to do that, and hopefully in a few years' time I'll teach my boy George to do it. So that's carried on, because I don't believe you can learn to do anything like this by looking at a picture in a book, or I can't. I can read, but I aren't all that very good at learning how to do things from a book. You can't beat being shown first hand how to do it. And my grandfather, this string I'm using here is brown string. That ain't too bad to use as it is. But this string, as you can see here, the netting string they used to use, they started with white string. It weren't dyed string. And my grandfather used to boil puffballs, or boil a big puffball in a saucepan, and make his own dye for dyeing this string, or this white string, to make that go a browny colour, or a sort of a khaki brown colour, the colour you can picture an old puffball being, because obviously if a rabbit come out of a hole and see that colour white string, that ain't going to come into that. It's going to see the white string and draw back. So that was his means of dyeing his nets, was to make his own dye out of puffballs. And that was, I suppose that was as good as anything you could buy in the shop. That was natural, and it wouldn't have had any smell other than a natural outside smell. So that's rabbit net making. This is a net, as I told you just now. This little needle I'm using here for making this rabbit net was really made a smaller version of this rabbit making needle, net making needle, for making these billiard nets. And this is an example. As you can see, it's got the smaller holes, exactly the same method of making as a rabbit net, and these are made for a billiard table. This billiard table net was made for a snooker table for Hatchiston Social Club. Well, we made a spare one, but we made a set of new pockets for the Hatchiston snooker table, which is, as I say, Hatchiston is the village where I was born, and did have a social club in the early days. This spade I'm holding here was my grandfather's long rabbiting spade, and apart from the fact that we used to use these, we'd carry this long spade with us, and a short one for digging out obviously fleet holes, and this long one for if you got in a place where there was a deep sandy hole that was a lot deeper than the length of the spade handle. We'd have this long spade with us, and we carried it with us to knock the hedges or knock the bushes with as well, because there's quite a bit of weight in it and a long handle. And then on the other end, if I can just turn it round, there's a hook on that end. This handle is about 6 foot long, and this hook is on the other end. So when you're dug down and found the hole, you then need to find the line to be able to bring that up to the surface. You could push this hook into the sand and hook the line, the line which is on the ferret's collar, and pull that up to the surface, and you're away again and dig another hole. But that was a lot of work involved in that, and sometimes there'd only be one or maybe two rabbits at the end of it. So we didn't do right a lot of. This spade didn't have all that much use, but if that meant digging the ferret out, we'd use this, and that would be the way we'd have to find it. And they all had one of them. That was my grandfather's, although that's had a new handle put in it, because the first one was full of worm, and like I say, we used to use them for hitting the bushes, and I can remember that flying to bits with a cloud of dust one morning when we were using it at Petestry, and my father had to put a new handle in. But that is his father's spade and hook. And another thing I got here is my Uncle Reuben's 20 bore, which I always think of as a boy's gun. It's made by Gallion and Sons at Cambridge, and that's a lovely little short, light, hammerless gun. Reuben used to give me cartridges and take me with this gun on a Sunday morning and take me shooting. He'd leave his own gun in the shed and just take me with this gun and his dog. And his dog, he'd dog the ditches and put the rabbits out for me, and then tell me when they come out of the ditch, according to how they were running, where I ought to shoot them. Because he never had a son of his own. He had a daughter. He never had a son of his own, and I think, like all his other brothers, he liked the idea of having someone he could pass on his knowledge to. So I had the opportunity to absorb the tradition and the knowledge of him and my own father, and 2 or 3 other brothers, Russell and Jack, were all into shooting and looking after ferrets, and they all worked on the land, and none of them had a son of their own. These brothers I used to go, there was another brother who did have a big family, but all the brothers I was involved with in my early childhood and growing up, they all wanted to tell me what they knew, because they wanted to pass on their knowledge and what they'd learnt off their father. So I had the opportunity to learn a lot. That's probably why I weren't any good at school. I hadn't got any room in my head for anything they wanted to teach me at school. That was too full of what I wanted to know. And Reuben used to take me shooting with this gun. As I say, he'd bolt the rabbits and tell me where to shoot. And if I was a bit late, if I shot too far behind and I caught a rabbit in the backside, he said, "That ain't the way, boy. If you shoot the head, the arse will die. You don't have to shoot the arse. That'll die if you hit the head." And that was how his way of telling me where to hit him. And he'd let me, amongst other things, he'd let me drive the A12 used to go right through Wickham then. That was before the bypass. And Reuben used to keep pigs, and he'd send me down to Rackham's mill, which was actually on the main A12. I used to go out to the bottom of Spring Lane where they used to live with his tractor with a box on the back, and go and get a bag of meal and a bag of middlings for his pigs. I was 14 then. He'd send me on my own to go and get that. I think that he liked the idea, as I say, he hadn't got a boy of his own, so he probably took a chance or two with me as if I was his own boy, and that was how he did. He'd let me get away with a lot. I couldn't do anything wrong in his eye. That was Reuben. Then there was my Uncle Jack. He lived in Wickham Market as well. He lived on the main road, on the Petestry Road out of Wickham Market, and he worked, well, as a young man he worked for Lawns of Wickham Market. He worked for John Lawn as a cowman, and in my recollection he worked on the duck cart, and he was a rabbit catcher for Nigel Holland at Petestry, at Gellham Hall and the Grove Farm, where I used to go with him when I was during my time, if I weren't at school or on a Saturday and Sunday. My father and me used to go with him in the winter time to help him with his rabbiting. And Jack was a real perfectionist, and really what set him apart really was his kind heart and his love of animals and the way he did everything properly. He was a perfectionist on the garden as well as the rabbiting, but the main thing that sticks out in my mind is he'd spend, if he found a rabbit ground in a big old clump of bushes, Jack would think nothing of spending an hour clearing it and putting the net, laying all the nets on it, and perhaps you'd do all that messing about and there might not be a rabbit in. Whereas Reuben's attitude would be, he'd have one look at a clump of brambles and say, "There ain't nothing in there, boy, we'll leave them ones." Because he didn't want to know about all that cutting the bushes out. He wanted to be having a shot. That's all Reuben wanted to do. So he'd say, "Just chuck the ferret in, let them bolt, or we'll leave them, ain't nothing in there." And Jack, another thing Jack used to do, which I don't remember the other brothers doing, was coping the ferrets. And that was, they'd use a similar string to this stuff here, only a slightly thicker, softer string. That was a white soft string, a bit thicker than that, and 2 strands of string with a pair of knots about 1 inch apart, and one knot went under here on the ferret, round the back of the neck behind the ears, and then that'd come forward there under the nose with the other knot and tie it on the top of the nose. Then the four ends tied together over the top of the ferret's head, and that formed a string muzzle. They always called it a cope. And we used that for bolting rabbits in somewhere where that was deep, like in a bank where you wouldn't be able to dig. You wouldn't want the ferret to lay up on a rabbit. That'd find them and put them out without being able to hold them. That was the idea of a cope. And the worst bit about coping a ferret was for the person who had to hold the ferret, because obviously they didn't like their head being tied up. So the person who was putting the cope on was fairly safe, and the one who was holding the ferret was the one who got bit. And I can remember one day at Wickham, where my Uncle Jack lived, he got a ferret out. They decided a plan of action where they were going to go and what needed doing, and if a ferret needed coping, my father would have to hold it because he was the youngest, and Jack would put the cope on. And I can remember one morning a big old ferret, because I used to use some big old ferrets for that. You needed a ferret with a neck, not so the cope couldn't come off. Dad was holding the ferret for Jack to put the cope on, and the ferret got the head round far enough to get hold of his finger and bit right into the bone, because I was trying to get away. And Uncle Jack see the comical side of that and say, "Do it a hat, boy? Well, that's right through onto the bone, and you can't make them let go." Well, you can make them let go, but one way I don't know if I ought to tell you. One way they make them let go is to put them on the ground and put the foot on the tail. That make them let go. But another way I've done it, because I've been bit several times in my lifetime. You do get ferrets that bite. Another way is to just hold the head in the water if you happen to be near enough. That'll make them let go, because they got to have air, and they do, when they get a hold, they mean it, some of them. Jack was set in his ways. He was an old boy, and I can remember when the bleeper, you may have heard of a bleeper, an electric ferret. They called it an electric ferret, they called it a bleeper, but basically that was a little battery that went in a box on the ferret's collar, and the receiver you held in your hand, and you'd put the ferret in the hole with a line on and a bleeper collar, and when the ferret stopped, that had found a rabbit, instead of you having to dig a yard at a time with a stick, mark the hole with a stick and then dig down with a spade, you might have to do that 4 or 5 times to find the ferret and the rabbit. The bleeper meant you could go straight to it. But Jack was getting an old man, and he couldn't see that being any good. He said, "That ain't being a good boy, we don't want to take that. We'll do it how we always have. That won't work." Poor old Jack was really dubious, so my dad purposely found a fleet long hole that was in sandy ground, but that was fleet. He put the ferret in with the bleeper collar on, and it went in. We used to have a line, and I still do, got one here, a hemp line, which is 8 yards long. That's a brand new one, had never been used. That's a hemp line which is 8 yards long, and they used to put a little tuft of string through the hemp, because this is like twisted rope. Put a little short piece in to mark a yard, so you knew if the ferret had gone in a yard, or 2 yards, however far that had gone. Well, they were marked as an 8-yard line, and my dad, that was a long hole that went right in the full length of an 8-yard line, and Dad tied another one on the end, and it went in another 2 or 3 yards. And Jack said, "That ain't a good boy, you won't get that, pull that off." He meant pull the ferret off, you won't get that. My dad said, "Wait a minute, I'll just see if I can find that with a bleeper." So he got the bleeper. I always used to keep it in a cloth money bag in his pocket to keep the dust out, because that was an expensive thing when they first came out. He kept it in a cloth bag in his pocket. He got it out, went across the ground, ranging the ground roughly where he thought that might be, and although sometimes you'd get Radio Caroline come across the airwaves on this little thing, when you did find the ferret, that bleeped, and you turn the volume down until you can hardly hear the bleep, and you could pinpoint it within 6 inches of where that was. And at the end of a hole, that was right at the end of the hole, and invariably at the end of a rabbit's hole they come upwards slightly, because if they went down and the water went in, that'd be the dampest end of the hole, so the end of the hole come up slightly to where that finish. My dad only he laid the bleeper down in the bag, and more or less poked the spade right through first time, right on top of the ferret, and got the rabbit out. And from then on, Jack was convinced. That's a bloody good thing, boy. I'm so glad you bought that. And we had a lot of use of that after that. Part of the farm where I used to go rabbiting with my dad's brother Jack, who was one of his older brothers, was on an apple farm. That was Harlan's at Petistry. And as I say, part of it was an apple farm. And Myxomatosis, at certain times of the year, the rabbits would catch Myxomatosis, and then towards the end of the year, some of them would recover and some of them wouldn't. But we put two and two together and realised on this same farm, the part where the apple trees were, the rabbits were always cleaner. So we used to leave them till last. Rabbit and the ferret and the ones around the apple fields, which was quite a big bit of the farm. And that occurred to us, the reason why they were free of Myxomatosis, or didn't have hardly any of it, was connected with the apple trees. And the old apple trees in an old orchard, about 3 foot off the ground where there was a crotch, and the branches all spread out from the crotch. You could see where the rabbits had jumped up into the trees, where they were only about that high off the ground, which was well within a rabbit's jump. They'd sit there and eat all the bark off round the inside of the tree, and that's one of the reasons they liked us catching them, because obviously they're damaging the trees. But them eating bark, there's something in that apple bark, I'm sure, that gives the rabbits an immunity, because they never had Myxie as rife or half as much as they did in the other parts of the farm where there weren't any apple trees. I'm sure that was something in that bark, and whether they knew it or not, I don't know. I know rabbits like fruit bark. All the branches that have been pruned off the trees would be white because they strip all the bark off them. But up in the crotch of the trees, they'd eat off the main trunk. And another part of the farm where we used to go was a wood called Potchard's Wood. And there's a story about there's a gibbet still in the wood. We didn't actually go in the wood. The wood was the farm bordered the wood, and through the edge of the field where we were and through the hedge into the wood, we'd obviously go both sides of the hedge because we were ferreting the field that bordered the wood. So we'd go one in the wood and one out. You could see the gibbet, and I can remember my father and my uncles telling me what that gibbet was. That was a place where a man was hung for murdering his master. That was a man called Jonah Snell, he worked at Leatheringham Mill, and he murdered his master, John Bullard, and his son with a hammer. And he was put in chains and dragged up the hill to the wood, which is still known as Drag Arse Hill. I expect a lot of people know it as that, but that was called Drag Arse Hill, and they took him into the wood and hung him on an oak gibbet with a spike on the top by his skull. And my uncles told me they left the corpse hanging in the wood till that was just a skeleton and a robin nested inside the skull. And I don't know whether that's true. I expect that is, because that's what they told to me. And we did a lot of our rabbiting around that area, and in the actual farmyard, Grove Farm, Petistry, I came across an old cowman, a character called John Barker, and his father, who was a cowman, made up a song called Potchard's Wood, and I have that sung regular here. I have a music night here, and I have he sing that regular, because that's a real good song, and that's peculiar to John. That's John's song. Another character I'd just like to tell you about was my uncle Basil, who come from Bedfield, which is where my grandfather was born. But Basil was married to my oldest auntie, my dad's oldest sister, Ollie, and they lived in an old rectory, or the old rectory at Bedfield. They lived in one end, and Harky Neslin, who was a fiddle player, lived in the other end, or the other side. And I can remember staying with them as a little old boy and hearing the fiddle strike up through the other side of the wall. Harky would be playing a tune, Feed the Birds or something like that, on the fiddle one side of the wall, and my Auntie Harley, my dad's older sister Harley, had a harmonium in the room the far end of their house, which was a wall away from Harky, and she used to go and play the other side of the wall. Or another time she might take me round to hear Harky, and that sounded to me, as I can remember thinking, that sounded like a cat, his old fiddle. I weren't very impressed with the fiddle playing, but I learned later in my life he was a well-known fiddle player, but I didn't know anything about Harky then. I just knew he was my Uncle Basil's neighbour. Basil had a vivid imagination. He'd come out with all sorts of stories to tell us when we were kids, and one I can remember was the things that used to come down his chimney. He'd say, "What do you think come down my chimney the other night?" And you didn't know what it was going to be, so you'd ask him, and he'd say, "A bloody rook." I never did believe a rook come down his chimney, but I used to want to hear the rest of the story, so I said, "What happened to it then, Basil? What did you do with it?" And he'd say, "Put it back up again, of course." So that was Basil. And he told me about when there was a petrol shortage and people were going round siphoning petrol out of people's cars. He had an old car in his garage, and his garage never had a back, and it had doors on. He drove the car in, there was no back. And he always said when they were going round siphoning petrol, they wouldn't have none of my petrol. He'd got a hay knife tied up in the roof of his garage. He'd tied a hay knife, and that was a sharp thing for cutting hay out of a stack. He'd tied a hay knife up in the roof of his garage with a bit of binder string and put the other end on his petrol cap, so if anyone went in there in the dark of his garage siphoned his petrol, that'd cut the hand off. That was Basil's answer for petrol siphoning. And as I say, I used to go and stay with them, so that was I used to stay with my Auntie Harley and him in Bedfield quite a lot when I was a boy. And one of my uncles was my Uncle Scorcher. He was an uncle on my mum's side of the family, but the reason I'm mentioning him is he was a gamekeeper. And when I was a boy, I used to go brushing on the farm where he looked after the pheasants, or two farms in my lifetime. He went from one place to another, but I used to go brushing, have a day off school and go brushing. And Scorcher was a rum old boy. He kept ferrets, and the farm where he worked on looking after the pheasants was a turkey farm. Scorcher used to he'd have 3 or 4 ferrets in a locker and give them a whole turkey. If a turkey died on the farm, he'd just give his ferrets a whole turkey to eat, so they lived on turkeys. And they had meat in there all the time, and his ferrets were like cats. You could hardly get both hands around one of his ferrets, but he could do anything. Well, he'd have you believe he could do anything with his ferrets. If you ever told him you'd done something or something had happened to you, that had already happened to him. Only that had happened that'd been better when it happened to him. He could always do that, and if he couldn't, his brother could. If there was something he hadn't done, his brother had done it. And one funny story I can remember about Scorcher is when he was shooting, he shot a stoat. A stoat come out of a rabbit ground, and Scorcher shot it, and he went to pick it up. He didn't realise that lay there still. When Scorcher went to pick it up, that fanged him through the thumbnail, and he had 2 tooth marks right through his thumbnail where a stoat fanged him. That was the sort of thing that would happen to Scorcher. And another time when I was brushing, he looked after the game on the farm and also the vermin, and he'd got a fox snare set beside a ditch. And a lorry driver who worked on the farm, who's still about, I won't mention his name, but a lorry driver who worked on the farm delivering turkeys and that sort of thing, he was brushing as well, and he got his foot caught in one of Scorcher's fox snares, and that hung him. He was hanging by his ankle head first in the ditch. He'd got caught in one of Scorcher's snares, so that was the air was blue for a little while with him hanging in Scorcher's snare. And Scorcher was one of these people you could play a practical joke on, and when I was a boy, I don't know if I got that off my Uncle Reuben or where I got that from, but I like a practical joke. And one practical joke I played on him was quavers. I don't know if you can still buy them. There was a packet of crisps called quavers, and Scorcher would have anything really. If you give him anything, he'd never say no. He'd always have it. And we had a package and come through the post or something, and packaging to make this parcel safe was polystyrene, and that was yellow, and that looked just like quavers, sort of curly bits of polystyrene. They looked for all the world like quavers, and so straight away I thought of Scorcher. I bought a packet of quavers and undone the bottom of the packet carefully and put these quavers in and sealed the bottom up, because I knew he'd open it at the top and he wouldn't know it had been tampered with. And I took them when I went brushing, and Scorcher was sitting there with his mates having his bait. Halfway through the day we were all sitting in the turkey shed having a bait. And I said, "Do you want a bag of quavers, Scorcher?" And he always used to call me Dunt. He said, "Thank you, Dunt, I'll have them in a minute, I'll have them in my sandwich." So he took this bag of quavers and he opened them, and he didn't want to be looking a fool in front of his mates, so he didn't say nothing. He started eating them. I suppose he thought they were a bit soft, but he didn't say nothing. He was eating them with a cheese sandwich. And he got about halfway through the packet. He said, "There's something wrong with these bloody things. Dunt, what you done to them?" I said, "I ain't done nothing to them, mate, just as I got them." And when he found out that polystyrene he'd been winding into, he weren't very happy. He weren't very happy with me, but I caught him out with a lot of things. Another time he had an old Austin A40, and he always used to come to ours on a Sunday night, and it had tin hubcaps, and I, playing about in the yard, I thought I'd have a laugh with Scorcher. I took one of the hubcaps off and put a couple of stones in, about as big as marbles, and put it back on again with stones in. Never said anything about it to Scorcher. And went on a week or two, and he said he talked to me dad. He said, "I had to take my car down the garage the other day. You know, I had a rattle in one of my wheels." He said, "I couldn't make out what it was. That stopped when you went fast, you know, but as soon as I was going slow, parking or anything, I could hear that rattling." He said, "I took it up to Heinen's." He said they took the hubcap off and 2 bloody stuns come out, and because then I laughed, so he found out who'd done it. That was another thing with Scorcher. And also, there used to be a column in the East Anglian Daily Times where they used to let you advertise something for £25 or under free of charge. So I advertised Scorcher's car in there, put his phone number in and advertised his car for £25, and he had because that weren't a very old car then, he had a rare lot of phone calls, people wanting to buy his car for £25, and he knew straight away who'd done that. And that was Scorcher. I was talking to you about my Uncle Basil just now. Well, one thing I remember about Basil, he'd always told me his father rode a tricycle, and that seemed funny to me. For Basil, when he told me that, was probably nearly 80, and when he told me his father rode a tricycle, I thought that was funny. But I learned out in later life the reason he rode a tricycle, he'd only got one arm, and I found a newspaper article that told me a lot of years later, I found it in a box I was repairing for somebody, that told me how he lost his arm in a flax machine, or got his arm caught in a flax machine and had to go to Home doctors and have his arm amputated, and that was with very little in the way of anaesthetic, I expect. But he was a lengthsman. Basil's father was a lengthsman, which meant he was responsible for looking after the road and the path and the hedge along a certain stretch of road or an area. And Basil was a lengthsman. I was always told he was a lengthsman when I was a boy and didn't know what a lengthsman was, but that's what Basil did as well. He was a lengthsman. And Basil's imagination, as I say, he told me some rum stories, and one of them, he went to buy a car off somebody in Bedfield, another old man in Bedfield, and he asked him questions like you do when you go to buy a car, and he said, "Don't lose any oil?" And the old boy said, "No. If anything, old partner, I think that gain a little." That's the only car I've ever heard of that could gain oil, but I should think the only way that could gain oil is if it had something mixed in with oil to make more, because that might have been water out of the cylinder head. But anyway, that's what he told me. Another thing they used to say, well, all of my dad's brothers, and obviously that was given to them by their grandfather, they always said, like when we were rabbiting and you got the ferret off, got the ferret out, they always used to look at the feet to see if it had got any dumb, because that'd tell you if ferret had found a rabbit and couldn't get to the head, that might come back. But you could see if I had found a rabbit or not, if you weren't able to hear it by looking at the front feet, and if it had been on a rabbit, that'd have done where that fur on its feet, where that had been trying to scratch the rabbit to get to the head to kill it, and that was what they called the fur dumb. And we also used to put a stick or a bramble up the hole. If the ferret weren't in there, to make sure there weren't another rabbit you couldn't reach, put a stick up the hole, and the end of a stick, that'd have a little bit of dumb on the end of it, and that'd tell you there was a rabbit still in there. And that was how they used to find out. And another thing we used to use was if a ferret had killed a rabbit in a pipe under a field gateway, or even in a hole, sometimes that'd work, was to use what they called a cock bramble, which is really a big old rose bramble out of a hedge. With you'd have a bit about as big round as your finger, and cut a bit about 1.5 yards long, and I can picture them cleaning the hooks off one end with a flasher, so the hooks point backwards on the bit you've left the hooks on. They point backwards, and by pushing that into a hole you could feel it go past the rabbit, and by twisting it into the fur you could pull a dead rabbit out of a pipe with it. And that's something that I ain't done it lately, but that'd work as well to this day. That you still find them, and I still always call them cock brambles, and that's how I refer to them, and that's what that always remind me of that when I see them. I really enjoyed hearing all my stories my uncles told me over the years, and I try and keep the traditions alive, and I try and do things the same way as they did, and as I showed you, using their methods and their tools as far as I can. And another thing, my Uncle Reuben was he didn't sing out in public, but he used to sing to himself, and I can remember him singing a lot of songs, what he thought of as modern songs, like he used to sing "You Can Bring Pearl, She's a Darn Nice Girl, but Don't Bring Lulu," and that was my mother's name, Pearl, so I expect that's why he used to sing that to me dad. And another song he used to sing was "Jim the Carter's Lad." And Reuben, in his younger days, used to work with a gypsy called Billy Barham from up Spring Lane in Wickham. Used to go with him to take Lino to Norwich with a horse and cart, and I can imagine Reuben sitting on the cart or walking beside the cart, as he would have done when that was loaded up with Lino. They'd have walked all the way to Norwich with a horse and cart, and I can picture him singing "Jim the Carter's Lad," because I used to hear him sing that when I was a boy. So I'll just sing you out with that. Well, now it's time to say good night, I must be on me way. Me hoss I will a-weary if I much longer stay. But you see your smiling faces makes me feel so glad. I hope you'll give your kind applause to Jim the Carter's Lad. So snap, crack goes my whip, I whistle and I sing. I sit upon me wagon, I'm as happy as a king. Me hoss is allus willin', for him I'm never sad. There's none that leads a life so gay as Jim the Carter's Lad.